Thanks for purchasing your HEMSA model H100 or H101. This will be an instructional video to answer any questions that you have as far as in setting up your machine or in running your machine, and also giving you safety procedures. The first area we're going to take a look at is when you get your machine. It'll be covered in visqueen, a wrapping that you're going to have. The head will also be banded on down onto your machine to keep your head from bouncing in transit. The first area you're going to want to look at is where are you going to locate your machine. When you pick your machine up, it can be picked up by a forklift. Your forklift will then be able to slide in underneath here onto the bottom, pick up on the back part of the feed, and then you'll be able to move it into position, wherever position you're going to want to have it. You're going to want to have power to it, and you're also going to want to have air to it. You'll need no less than 85 psi, 110 psi will work very nicely, and you'll need either 220 or 440 power to the machine. After you have the location set on your machine, the next area you're going to want to go to is you're going to want to unstrap your machine and then go into a leveling pad. On the leveling pad on your machine, you're going to have two separate types of pads. You're going to have a rectangular pad here, and you're going to have a round circular pad. The round circular pad will go into the corner right underneath behind the motor, and this will be your corner area to this side of the machine to the back. The rectangular pad that we're going to have, you're going to notice it has two holes into it. One hole is going to be a tapped hole. The other hole is going to be just a drilled hole. You'll place these pads under this portion of the machine, and the circular pad will be the first one set over in your other corner on your machine. You'll go ahead and set it, and then you'll start to level your machine. What you'll want to do is, if you get air power to your machine itself, you're going to want to level everything from the center underneath your vise system here on your machine. In order to raise your machine, it is possible to do that without having any electrical power to the machine. If you have air pressure to it and your machine is hooked up, then what you're able to do is to increase your cutting force pressure. If you take your pressure, and as I go ahead and bring the pressure up, and my numbers will be decreasing on the dial, I can raise it up to a point where my head will begin to rise. I can lower it slightly just to hold the head. At that point in time, I can come around and remove the piece of wood. For safety's sake, with the head pressure holding the head up, I can go to the side of the machine and block the feed rate control off. This gives you a double block so the head itself can't move or can't fall. If I reduce my cutting force pressure, my head will remain locked up, which now I would be allowed to open my feed rate control to allow the head to come down. Now I'll block the head, hold it here, which now I have my block out. I'll have my blade where it can be either, if it hits your material here, the blade that comes onto it, you could do either a little slight damage, or you can keep your pressure, as we had talked about, right here, and keep it above it slightly. The first area we'll go onto it is we'll open up our vise. When our vise is open, which will allow us to go ahead and to put a level in here, so we're going to want to level it this direction, across our machine, and then we're going to want to turn that level perpendicular and level it coming in through the machine. So what we'll do now is we'll go ahead. You can either raise the machine itself with a forklift to lift it up, where you can put the leveling pads onto it, or you can go ahead and use a crowbar system to go ahead and pick the machines up with the corner pads, is what we're going to do here. Okay, now we're ready at this point in time to go ahead and put in our rectangular leveling pads. So I'll use my trusty assistant, Al, will come in and give me a hand raising the machine up. As you can see, he's using a very small crowbar to lift the machine. These are welded, real solid, so it's easy to pick the machine up at this point right here. So we can go ahead and lift here. You can see the leveling pads slide in where you have your large open hole, drilled hole here, and then your tapped hole will slide in here. Make sure you keep your fingers out of the way and don't put them underneath. At this point in time, you can go ahead and take your large bolts, slide them on down, put your other tightening bolts to hold it. Go ahead and lower it. Okay, if it lowers here and we're holding it up on the side, we may be caught on an edge. So what we'll go ahead and we'll wiggle it to make sure it levels and sits in. Go ahead and raise it up just slightly. Okay, start to lower it. There we go. We can see it start to sit down. Okay, just for a quick review on the leveling pads, it is important to make sure that your fixed circular pad is located underneath your motor and underneath your solenoids at this point. Your rectangular pads are located onto your other parts of the machine. Now we'll get into leveling the machine. At this point, we're ready to go ahead and start to level our machine. What we're going to use here is we're going to use a machinist level. Now, it is possible to use other levels. The main point that you're going to have is you're going to want to be able to make sure it's going to go ahead and fit underneath your arm of the machine. So you're going to be able to go ahead and we're going to go from left to right and from the back of the machine to the forward part of the machine to make sure our level fits. So what we're going to do now is we'll go ahead and set our level underneath in between our vices. At this point in time, I'm ready for my trusty assistant, Al, to come on in and give me a hand leveling the machine. What Al's going to do is he'll go ahead and start to turn the screws on the corner while I go ahead and watch the bubble level. So I'll make sure I have it leveled in my plane this direction and then my next plane from the rear to the front, and I will change my level from one side to the other to make sure it's true. We'll go ahead and start now.
Take it up, Tim.
You bet. Okay, now we're going to want to start to level from the back. As you can see, this leveling process is very simple. It just takes a matter of minutes to set, and then you'll have your machine set up into a level plane. Now that we have our machine leveled in both directions here, the next question is as we come on down to lock it down, we make sure that all of our bolts are snug down tight. This bolt we have locks it down into position. We screw it down and then take our locking nuts and we go ahead and we lock them down. The next question is usually asked is, I have holes here. Should I go ahead and anchor my machine down to the floor? It is the manufacturer's recommendation that you don't. And the reason being is bandsaw machines are generally loaded with overhead cranes or forklifts. And if you bump into a machine, you want your machine to be able to slide on the floor. If we go ahead and we anchor it to the floor, then what will happen is you can go ahead and you can bend up your sheet metal on the machine, or we can bend the machine. So we recommend that you just go ahead and lock everything down here, but you don't bolt it to the floor. Now we're ready to install the stop control rod. The stop control rod has a lower stop to it and an upper stop with a microfine adjustment on it. This allows you to finely tune the height of the saw. The lower stop allows you to control how far the head falls and the blade will go into the cutting block. This is easily installed by taking a bolt on top of the stop block and a bolt and loosening the bolt on the side of the stop block. The stop block is then removed. On the top of the cylinder, we have a bolt, and that bolt will need to be removed. And now we can take our stop rod, remove our upper stop, slide it through our stop block, and screw it in to the top of the cylinder. It's always important to make sure on our stop block that we have our limit switches facing away from us and our bolt facing toward us. At this point in time, we can go ahead and turn our rod, allowing our stop block to rest in its bottom position. At this point, we're able to go ahead and to replace our top bolt and tighten our side bolt. Now we can slide our upper control stop, putting our pin into it and moving it so it faces our forward position here. At this point in time, we're ready to go ahead and put power to our machine. It is HEMSAW's philosophy to always have a qualified electrician come in and hook your power up. We don't want to have any of our customers electrocute themselves. Now that you've had the electrician go ahead and put power to your machine, it's going to be time that we're going to want to bring power up to our control console. We accomplish this by putting our switches into the center position. Then we put our power to power start, and our light will illuminate. If by chance your machine's switches on your console are not in the center position and you try to put power start, the light will not illuminate. Make sure your switches are in the center and then hit power start. If we hit lift, the arm will then rise by moving our switch to the center position. This is also true with the motor, to turn the motor on, because we're going to need to have the motor running to cut a groove in our cutting block. In order to do this, we're going to want to go ahead and increase the force on our arm, and we can do this by taking and increasing the number on our dial. If we increase the number and our head doesn't fall, what we'll have is our feed rate control would be blocked off. We want to make sure our feed rate control is open approximately 3 turns. We can see our arm is starting to descend now. It's important if we take and we decrease the pressure to our head, or the force, our head will rise back up. We're going to want to find a balance point in the arm. This is going to be when we take and we decrease the force on the head to the head no longer falls. This will approximately be about 3.5 on this machine. On your machine, it may vary. It might be slightly higher, it could be slightly lower. When we get close within about 1 inch of our cutting block, we're going to turn our motor on. We're going to keep our hand on the lift. So as soon as our teeth strike the cutting block and they get into the depth of approximately the teeth, we're going to want to put our arm into the lift mode. I'll demonstrate. I increase our head force approximately 1 on our dial from 3.5 to 4.5. My head is descending. If I want to speed my head coming down, I can increase my cutting force. Then I'll decrease it back to 4.5. I'll hit motor on with my hand on the lift. Once our cutting block is cut, and this is accomplished, we're going to want to go around behind our machine, take our wrench, and tighten up the nut on our control rod. With the nut tightened, we're going to want to lower our arm back down with the motor off. We can increase the force to cause our head to fall faster. And then we'll adjust our lower stop. Now with the head in the lower position, we can take and adjust our stop until it's hitting our fixed block here with our limit switches. Once we have it adjusted, take our Allen wrench, Tighten the Allen screw, and our head is locked into position. The next area of importance that we need to look at is how to change the bandsaw blade. In order to do this, the first thing that I recommend is to go ahead and get yourself a set of gloves. You never want to be handling a sharp new bandsaw blade or an older bandsaw blade without a set of gloves on. Now, these are the only times that I recommend in bandsawing to have gloves on, and that's only during a bandsaw blade change. We'll get into some of the other reasons why you don't want to wear gloves a little later on. Well, now that we've got our gloves on, what we want to do is open up our wheel covers. Before we do open up our wheel cover next to our band tension lever, we want to go ahead and take our band tension off by turning our lever. It's important to keep this bandsaw blade cover closed in case something were to happen with this bandsaw blade and it were to snap and break. It would protect us. When we are taking the bandsaw blade and taking the pressure off by turning our handle here, once again it is important never to stand in front of this. You always want to stand to the side. If there's ever a problem or something ever happens to this piece right here, you just never want to stand in front of it. So now that we're to the side, we'll loosen up our bandsaw blade. Now that our blade is loose, we can turn around and open our cover. The next area, we want to take an Allen wrench and open up our guides. At this point, we'll take our bandsaw blade, tap it on the back of the blade, and open it up. Next, we will loosen our blade brush. At this point, our bandsaw blade comes out. We take our blade, fold it up, tie it or tape it, and put it into a safe place. When we receive a new bandsaw blade, it's very important not to take and to throw it onto the floor. What we need to do is to open our bandsaw blade, and if you move your blade around, you'll find a point where the blade wants to open itself up. When you have that point, I recommend holding it in one hand at the point here and then opening it up with the other hand. It is next very important to take a look at which way the teeth are going. If the teeth are traveling in the wrong direction, you will have to flip a blade by rotating it. Always check this, because I have seen customers before have a bandsaw blade on backwards and try to cut material. They usually feel a little silly when they call you and they tell you their machine isn't working. If you come on out and take a look at it, or a technician looks at it and the blade's not on properly. When we put the new bandsaw blade on, once again it's important, have the gloves on. Make sure that your bandsaw blade is riding against this bumper block. This is very important. If it were to ride on top of this bumper block, when you tension the bandsaw blade, it would damage the blade itself. It would cause the blade to fatigue and break. The next area that you would want to do is occasionally you would take your guide caps off and clean behind them. And I would recommend doing that about every second or every third blade change. Once you have your bandsaw blade on, you want to put a slight amount of tension on it to hold the blade onto the wheel, but you don't want to tension it with a great amount of tension onto it, because we have to rotate it 90 degrees to get it inside of our guides. Once we have it inside of our guides, we take our Allen wrench and we lightly, right now with one slight finger, put light tension onto it to hold our blade straight. We don't take it and twist it tight. We use very light pressure. The next area we're going to want to set is our bandsaw blade brush. Our bandsaw blade brush just slightly goes into the gullet of the bandsaw blade in order to knock the chips out. We use a 1/2-inch wrench to set it. The next area we look at is on our bandsaw blade brush. We have a wheel which rides against our drive wheel. This wheel has to have light pressure onto it. We can take and loosen it up where we're able to turn it, lightly turn it. And we will tighten this where we're starting to receive a little bit of resistance onto it. Now it's tight enough where I'm slightly able to turn it still, but I have a reasonable amount of pressure onto it. Now we're ready to tighten the bandsaw blade. We should close the covers. This is very important in case the bandsaw blade is not welded correctly. What could happen is if you don't close the covers and tighten the blade, and the bandsaw blade were to break at the weld, it would open up and it could catch you and cut you pretty severely. Once again, it is very important not to stand in front of the tension handle. As you can see, I'm standing behind the tension handle, and I find it's very easy to tighten the handle. I tighten this handle to the flat washer is 1/8 of an inch of our stop rod. This sets the proper tension. Next, what I want to do is remove the gloves. It's very important not to operate a bandsaw machine with gloves on. Reason being is if your hand were to ever get caught in that blade and you had gloves on, it'll grab the glove and cause your hand to roll in, and it could sever the fingers. Very important never to wear gloves. What we will do next is bump our motor, but in order to do that, we have to make sure all of our switches are in the center position, because our broken blade out of stock switch light would be on. So we must turn this light off by hitting power start. With all of the switches in the center position, This is important, which will go ahead and turn this out. Once again, if any of these levers are turned in the bottom position, you will not be able to bring your power up. This is a safety feature designed into the equipment that you're not able to have your hand or another piece in the equipment itself and accidentally bump it and start it and create some problems. So it's important that when you're resetting everything, that everything is in the center. It was in the center, we brought the power back up, so we had power. After we turn the motor on, just slightly, what we want to do is reset our guides. We use the 2-finger rolls and we snug it up till it takes all the play out. The reason we bump the motor is in case we have chips on. There we've changed the bandsaw blade. The next area that we're going to look into is going to be setting our vices. This is accomplished rather easily. Our main vice, we have a ratchet system. This is a self-ratcheting system. It can either be picked up and slid forward or back, or from the front. If we hit our close mode, it will actually cause our vise to ratchet in. On our feed vise, this is set rather easily. This is a cam lock system on our feed vise. Raise the cam lock up and it slides very easy. It helps to hold it on the bottom slightly. One of the things that can happen is you have 2 bolts on the top. If the bolts loosen up, the vise itself won't lock. If the vise doesn't lock and it tries to grab some material, this switch right here will tell the machine that it is out of stock. In order to set the vise, raise the handle up, finger tight the top of the bolts, and then you can go ahead, back down just slightly, and lock it in. Now it's not going to move. So if I can get my assistant Al to go over here and move a piece of material onto it, we'll go ahead and set the vices.
I don't think so, Tim.
Okay, now that we've got our material into it, to move our main vise, we can slide it into position. Our feed vise, grabbing it on the bottom, slides into position, and our cam lock, and now we're set. Now we're ready to go ahead and install our coolant line. This is easily accomplished by sliding it through our fittings and putting it into our coolant T-block. We take the other end of our polyflow, slide it underneath our index feed table, where my assistant Al will go ahead and install it into our coolant pump. Once this is accomplished, we put it back into the tank, slide the tank underneath the saw where the coolant can drain back into the pan, and plug our coolant pump cord line into the plug. And now we're ready to learn how to operate our hem saw machine, how to operate our controls, and how to use the machine efficiently. We're going to be doing some cutting, so with good shop practices, we're going to put on our safety glasses to protect ourselves from any chips that may be thrown up from the blade. In order to start, we have to do is we have to bring up power to our control console. We accomplish this by moving our switches to the center position and moving our power switch to the power start. Our light will illuminate. We have three positions in our switches. We have our manual, which is the lower, our off, which is in the center, and auto, which is on top. So when we get ready to go ahead and to cut on auto, what we want to have to do is the first thing we're going to have to decide how many parts do we want to cut. The next question is how many indexes do we want? If we're only cutting a single index of under 24 inches, we're going to want to have our feed mode switch on single and our feed indexer switch on 0, because that'll tell us how many feeds required that we're going to need. If we're going to cut parts that are longer than 24 inches, we're going to have our feed mode switch on multiple, and we're going to have our feed counter switch on the amount of switches we're going to need to index. An example would be if we need to cut 4 feet, we're going to want 2 indexes of 24, and we would be on multiple and 2. So we're getting ready to set up to cut here. We're going to go ahead and adjust our height stop. We're going to put our machine into the automatic mode. We're going to accomplish this by putting our feed going from right to left in the auto position. We've started our machine by hitting our auto start. We'll want to make sure our pounce counter has the amount of parts that we're going to want to cut. Right now we have 1 part in our parts counter. When we hit auto start, you saw our feed index forward and then the saw head come down and cut. When we finish the cut, our indexer indexes and our counter goes to 0. Once we have 0 on our counter, our machine will quit cutting. We always want to be careful when we're cutting that we go use good shop safety practices. We always want to keep our hands away from the saw operating in cutting area. When we finish this cut, our counter's at 0. Our machine will shut down. In order to adjust our feed length, this feed right here was approximately 850 thousandths. If we need to adjust our feed length to cut our next parts, and our parts need to be 2 inches, 250 thousandths, or 500 thousandths, or up to 24 inches, what we're going to want to do is move our feed vise to the lower position, which moves our feed cylinder forward. Then we're going to walk to the back of our machine, to the parts counter, and dial in the length that we're going to need. We come back to the front of the machine and we put our feed back into the auto position. Remember, in order to cut an auto cycle, we want to make sure all of our switches are in auto. If we don't want to use auto and we want to use it in the manual mode, all of our switches would then go to the bottom accordingly to whichever mode we want to do. Motor, vice, move to the center and our head will fall. Put it back into auto and our head will lift. If we're cutting and we come into a panic situation, we make a mistake, what we would want to do is if we were in the auto cycle and we were to cut a part, let me put a number in our counter, I'll put 1 into it, and I want to hit start cut, what that would do is give us a part as it came on down. It starts to cut, but this isn't what we want it to do. We can go ahead and hit our button on the side of the console, and that will allow the head to rise back up and our motor would turn off. In order to reset it, we would put our motor switch back into the center position, which is the safety interlock, that we don't want our motor to kick on, while we go ahead and reset our power switch. We'll then turn off our broken blade out of stock. The next thing that would happen is our top panic switch here will kill all power to the machine. If we get into a cut and we panic and we hit this button, it kills power to the machine and our head will descend. So if we would have had the material move forward, we would have the weight of the head coming down onto the material. In order to set the switches, reset them, and to bring the power back up to the console, what we do is we move our switches back to the center position and we hit power start. Let's go ahead and do a multiple index. What we're going to want to do is make our shuttle move forward twice. In order to accomplish that, what we'll do, move our switches from right to left in the center position. We don't want to hit our auto start until we have everything set up in our feed mode, which is going to be multiple. Feed requires, let's do 2 indexes. So we'll put 2 on our dial here. We're going to want to hit auto start, which will allow our feed to index twice first and then cut. If we hit start cut, we would do a trim cut first and then it would index. I'll demonstrate with auto start. First index, our second index, now the head will come down. Now I can control the amount of force on my head as it's going through the work by changing my cutting force. To increase the force, I increase the numbers. We can see my head is pushing harder through the material. As you can see now, I'm pushing extremely hard. Or I can back the pressure off and I'm cutting much slower. The question always arises, what is the proper feed force to apply to my blade in my work. There are many variables on that. It depends on your tooth configuration and the type of materials. We always recommend looking at the chips. If you're cutting mild steel, you want a nice curly chip or a pigtail. As a rule of thumb, you find your balance point, which we did earlier. Our balance point here is 3.5. And generally, you wouldn't want to exceed, if we balance at 3.5, generally you wouldn't exceed 5.5 to 6. That would be a heavy feed force. The other control that you use, and we set it for entry and exits, is our feed rate control. And how this is used, this controls how fast the head falls. It's used for entry and exits into the material. You don't want to allow the head to come falling so fast into the work that it would tend to want to tear off a blade. So a reasonable speed is about what I'm demonstrating here. So you want a nice easy entry and a nice easy exit. Then you'll do all of your cutting using your feed force. This will allow the head to compensate as it goes through varying cross-sectional areas, to speed up and to slow down as it goes through the material. We have our cutting force on top. We have our clamping force on the bottom. Where we use our clamping force is when we get into cutting thin-walled material. If we're cutting something that's very light-walled, we don't want the vices to crush it. By reducing our pressure, lowering it on the dial, decreases our clamping pressure, so we won't squeeze the walls of some light tubing or an extrusion or something we have on this order. So what we'll do now is we're going to go ahead and make a few cuts, measure the parts, and then go ahead and set our feed index. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and set our feed length. We'll go ahead and dial in about 4 or 5 cuts to make sure everything repeats. After we dial it in, we'll go ahead and measure our parts. And after we measure our parts, we'll go ahead and calibrate our indexer. Now that we've just finished cutting a few parts, we had our counter set, or our length positioner set, at 1 inch. What we did is we cut about 4 to 5 parts and we measured the last 3. In measuring the parts, we found their length to be 850 thousandths. They were all within a couple of thousandths. So our part length digital positioner is off 150 thousandths. So we need to correct the length and make it read the same thing that our parts read. We accomplish this by first removing the cover. After the cover is removed, we loosen and remove 3 of the screws on the bottom of our counter. What this will allow us to do is to move our digital length position counter here to 850 thousandths. Now that our counter will go ahead and measure the exact same length that our parts were. Then we slide our bevel gears back together and replace the screws. By doing this, we have automatically adjusted for the kerf on the blade, and by measuring several parts, we made sure of the length that we're cutting. This is accomplished in just a matter of minutes. And once it's set, it usually will not have to be reset. If your machine is cutting slightly long or short, generally I recommend the first place to look is a chip. A chip may be in the forward stop position. We replace our cover, tighten our screws. Our digital positioner reads 850 thousandths, which matches 850 thousandths on the parts. Now remember, you need to cut 4 or 5 parts when you do this, just to make sure your lengths don't vary. Once this is accomplished, remove the cover, change it so our lengths match, and then you have it set.
Okay.
Now that you've seen how to install a hem saw and how to operate a hem saw, it's real important to talk about maintenance of a hem saw. Hem saws require very little maintenance, but there are certain things that make a hem saw run much better. A very clean machine is a happy machine. It'll be much more trouble-free for you if you keep the machine clean. What I generally recommend is to wipe the machine down, and I recommend wiping it down with either a brush or a rag. Don't use an air hose on it and blow it down, because it can blow chips into areas that you just don't want chips, as far as under vice ways or into limit switches. These things just aren't recommended. When you wipe the machine down, it's always nice on the ways where your guide arms are, is after it's wiped down, to go ahead and to put a little light oil on it, something on the order of a WD-40. That's also got a little rust inhibitor. Also onto the slides where the vices go. Also where the feed slides forward onto it, which is very nice. In the wheels itself, in our idle wheel, we have a grease zerk. This zerk right here ought to have a little bit of grease pumped into it about once a month. You have hydraulic oil in the back, which goes into the cylinder here. We recommend that you check the hydraulic oil about once a month, just to make sure there hasn't been any oil seeping out. We recommend a lightweight hydraulic oil into it. About once a year, we recommend draining the hydraulic oil and replacing it with new hydraulic fluid, just in case you have any type of contamination or you get a little bit of water into it. Another area that we recommend on a daily basis is to walk around on the back of the machine and check the filter lubricator. You have an oiler on one side, make sure it has a lightweight oil into it. On the other side, you have a water trap. With a water trap, you just want to make sure that the water trap is drained on a daily basis, especially if you're in a very humid climate. There's other areas that you're going to want to check. You're going to want to make sure, generally once a week, that the guide caps are taken off and the guide caps are cleaned to make sure everything is adjusted properly in there. And there isn't too much adjusting, but if you get them filled and packed with chips, it doesn't allow the blade properly, and it can allow the saw to cut out one direction or another direction. So you want to make sure that that's done. You want to make sure that you check your blade brush, that the blade brush is set up properly into the bandsaw blade itself, that your bristles on the blade brush aren't worn down to nubs, that the wheel is properly adjusted, where we had talked about it earlier. I also recommend about every 6 months or so to go on out and take a look at the gearbox to make sure that the gearbox has the proper amount of oil in it. We recommend a special kind of oil for it. Make sure when you check it, check the manuals or call us and we'll tell you on the type of oil. It's very important you use a non-sulfurized oil. Otherwise, the sulfur in the oil will attack the phosphor bonds in the gears and it can destroy the gears. Other than that, the machine itself has a slight air leak, which you would hear. That air leak is important to hear. It's got a slight screw here on the top, and if somebody shuts it down and you don't hear a slight air bleed, you want to take a screwdriver and slightly crack it open. As you can see, there's not a heck of a lot into maintaining the machine, but if you do these little maintenance tip items to it, keep the machine clean, keep it slightly oiled, check all of the fluid levels, check everything onto the machine will treat you superbly for years and years to come. We hope you enjoy the machine. Even if you've managed to sleep through the rest of the video, please pay attention to this portion. What we're going to talk about is safety. When you're operating a hem saw, it's always important to wear safety glasses, to have safety shoes on, never to have gloves on your hands when you're operating the machine. The only time you wear gloves is when you go ahead and you change a blade. Never put your hand, arm, leg, elbow, head, foot, toes, or any part of your body in the cutting operating area. Never put your hands or any part of your body into the vices, because someone may accidentally hit a switch and turn it on. Never stand between the shuttle vise when it moves forward, because it could possibly injure you. Always be aware of your surroundings on the machine. Never operate the machine if you're under the influence of alcohol or any kind of drug, including prescription drugs, because they may affect your awareness around the machine. When you take and you change a bandsaw blade, never stand in front of the handle. Always stand to the side, either to the back or to the front. If for some reason you need to work on your hem saw, it's very important to take a mechanical stop like a block of wood, raise your arm up, put the block of wood underneath as a mechanical stop, lower the head down until it rests on the mechanical stop, go back Turn the electricals off. Make sure that they're locked out. Make sure that the air pressure is off. These are real important things. Never take the bandsaw blade covers and open them when the bandsaw machine is running, for any reason. That's very important. In our controls here, we have special lockouts. One of them would be is if you go into a panic situation and you want to kill all power to the console, we can go ahead and hit our top button. What that will do is it will kill all of the power to the machine. If we're in a cutting mode, again, we'll center all of our switches and bring our power up, and we're making a cut, put my glasses on. And I hit my side panic button, my motor turns off, and my head rises up. My vices stay clamped, and my arm, once again, lifted up. If I want to reset this switch, I turn my motor to the off position, which is the center. I hit my power start. At this point in time, my broken blade out of stock light has turned off, and I can go ahead and I can operate the machine. We feel at HEMSAW it's very, very important to operate your HEMSAW with shop safety practices. We at HEMSAW never want anybody to ever be injured on one of our machines. We care about our customers and we care about our operators. So when you operate the machine, please always pay attention. Please always operate it with shop safety practices. Don't wear gloves when you're operating it. Wear glasses and safety shoes. We at HEMSAW care about our operators. We care about our customers. And we care about you.